Hello, my name is James Inciardi. I'm going to be talking about VQ mismatching. If you can understand this presentation about VQ mismatching, you might understand why I put a bunch of pictures of dams and rivers in my PowerPoint. Okay, so let's get started. Here are my objectives. Here are my objectives. Describe what a VQ mismatch is, describe zones of the lung, and describe what factors help the pulmonary arterial pressure remain nominal. VQ mismatching was a concept I had a really hard time grasping when I was in school, and since this presentation is designed for beginning respiratory therapy students, I'm going to spend a little more time describing it so that everyone understands it. Basically put, a VQ mismatch is when there's either more perfusion than ventilation or more ventilation than perfusion in the lung. Okay, now I'm going to spend a little bit of time drawing here, so no fear laughing at me if my drawing doesn't look very good. But let's get this on here. Okay, so this drawing helped me when I was trying to understand it. This is your artery, your pulmonary artery. I'm sorry, it's actually supposed to be blue blood coming in like this. Okay, blue blood going all around here. And now these light blue areas over here, this and this, are alveoli. That's it's the blue blood picks up the oxygen and it becomes red blood and goes into circulation. Okay, and feeds tissues the oxygen that they need for metabolism. Okay, you all know about that. Now, supposing for a second we did not have, this alveoli did not have any oxygen in it. Okay, well, that would mean that the body is just going to get more blue blood coming in like this. Okay. So it's getting some red blood, but it's also getting a lot of blue blood. And so that's a problem because that means that the oxygen, the body is not getting the oxygen that's needed. It only gets a fraction of the amount that it's supposed to get, So in this case, there's not enough oxygen and the perfusion is fine, but there's not enough oxygen. Or supposing, that there was some kind of a blockage, right here, big blockage here. Well, then there's no blood coming in here at all, nothing. And so then we have another VQ mismatch. We don't have any perfusion, but if this was red blood, you'd be getting some of this, but not enough. Okay, so that's basically what VQ mismatch is all about. Okay, so let me go back to my PowerPoint. Okay, so the patent foramen ovale, this is a good example of what's going on with a VQ mismatch. You see here, this is a patent foramen ovale. This is supposed to close in a child at childbirth, and in patent foramen ovale, this did not close. And so we see some of this blue blood mixing in with the red blood and being put back into circulation. This is what we call a venous admixture, when there's venous blood mixing with the arterial blood. So that's why this blood here is purple, because it's got some oxygen in it, but not really enough. Okay. So VQ mismatch sounds like it's a really serious deal, and it is, and it's a severe matter. But when you look at the zones of the lung, we see that VQ mismatching actually happens all the time. On the top of the lung, there's very little blood flow. The pulmonary arterial pressure is just enough to perfuse this area of the lung. However, this area of the lung is also best ventilated, so there's not a lot of blood flow, but there is a lot of ventilation. And zone 3 is the opposite. We see lots of blood flow. However, we also see the least amount of ventilation in this area. Zone 2 is kind of like a Goldilocks area, where the amount of blood flow and the amount of ventilation is most equal. Now I'm going to get into resistance, lung volume and resistance. It turns out that the least amount of resistance to pulmonary blood flow happens at FRC. FRC, or functional residual capacity, is when the lung is not inhaling but not exhaling either. It's kind of a neutral state. At that point, the vessels inside the lungs present the least amount of resistance to blood flow. When the lungs are at RV, or residual volume, that means that the lungs are deflated as much as you can make them. You've exhaled as much as possible. At that point, there is more resistance, as you can see by this curve here. But why is there more resistance? It's because the capillaries are tethered open, attached to the lung parenchyma. So when the parenchyma is deflated, the capillaries will collapse. When the lungs are fully inflated, resistance increases then too, and we're not really sure why that is. We think it's because it's kind of like a rubber band that's being stretched out all the way. Give me a second and I'll explain. So you can imagine this rubber band here, if there was a hole in it and you stretched it out, that hole would get longer and narrower, kind of like this, like that. Okay. Can you kind of see that a little bit better now? Yeah, so I hope you can kind of understand that a little better. And this is actually, I like this picture a lot because you can see how the capillaries open and then they kind of get narrower when there's a lot more pressure and a lot more lung volume. And here they're open, but they're not. They're ready to collapse. Okay. So I put this slide in. This is a picture of a spillway in a dam. Sometimes the pressure behind a dam is so great that they'll open up the spillway and let some water out to relieve some pressure. Kind of like a pressure relief valve, but they don't always do this in spillways to relieve pressure. They also do it to generate energy. Isn't that interesting? Well, did you know that your lungs have spillways too? That's right, they do. And that's why systemic pressure in the body may rise during exercise, but in a pulmonary system, the pressure remains roughly the same. When we're at rest, a lot of the capillaries will remain closed and somewhat constricted. As pressure increases with exercise, additional capillaries will recruit and dilate, acting as spillways for additional pressure. However, the reason for this recruitment and dilation is not really to relieve pressure, although that has some part to play also. It's to provide additional blood flow to the lungs in times when exercise is needed. Additional capillaries will recruit as pulmonary pressure increases. Vessels will become more distended too. And this is the reason why in normal lungs pressure remains largely steady in spite of exercise and increasing heart rate and increasing systemic blood pressure. These two sides show how capillary distension increases with increasing pressure, and additional capillaries will also recruit with increasing pressure. And as these capillaries increase in distension and recruitment, the amount of perfusion increases and pulmonary pressure remains the same. Now, just for a second, imagine that these capillaries remained open and dilated all the time, even when we're at rest. That would create a greater VQ mismatch. The heart would have to pump harder to keep them perfused all the time, and we'd have to breathe harder to make sure that they get all the oxygen. So these capillaries will shut down when not needed, and therefore no blood will be oxygenated, and they'll be oxygenated someplace else in the lung. Okay, now it's time for a pop quiz. Question number 1, what is an example of a disease or a condition that creates a VQ mismatch? Well, I already gave you one, remember, the foraminal valley, but there's also pulmonary embolism, and there's a number of others. But you could just say, well, there's a VQ mismatch all the time when we talk about zones of the lung. Remember, I covered that too. Yeah, and then here's my next question. Give 2 examples of mechanisms that the pulmonary system employs to keep arterial pressure in the lungs steady during exercise. Well, we talked about how the capillaries will dilate and recruit with greater pressure to make sure that there's more blood flow to the lungs. All right, well, that was my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something from it. If you have any questions, there's my email right there. Thank you very much, and Happy studying.